in the United States has not been dropping. So this graph only goes through 2012. But if you look up the National Agricultural Statistics Service data, going up at least through 2018, you can see that the total number of US honeybee colonies has remained pretty constant, around 2.5 million honeybee colonies. So, you know, all the people who are sending me things through social media saying that honeybees are going extinct and that we're all going to die, that's actually not really the case. So beekeepers have ways of increasing their colonies and making up for their losses, even, you know, pretty severe losses of like a third of their honeybee colonies, by splitting their hives, by buying queens from queen breeders, by creating nucleus colonies. So they have ways of making up their losses. But it is a major problem for them, and we are losing a lot of beekeepers, and a lot of beekeepers are struggling economically because this is a burden on them to keep their colonies going. The biggest problem they have is this mite species, which is called the varroa mite, that has really been a pandemic in the honeybee world. So they are all over the world except for Australia. They developed on they evolved on an Asian species of honeybee closely related to our species, and they jumped species into the Apis mellifera, what's called the Western honeybee that we keep all over the rest of the world outside of Asia. And when they jumped species, they also increased the severity of a number of viruses. So we now know that there are at least 22 different viruses that we've found in honeybee colonies. And many of them, particularly one that's called the deformed wing virus, have become much more severe because they're transmitted by these mites. And there's starting to be evidence of spillover of some of these viruses, particularly deformed wing virus, from honeybees into other species of bees, particularly bumblebees. So, so this is a huge problem. There are a lot of forces that are affecting honeybees, and I'll talk later on about pesticides, which are also a big problem. But this, you know, there's pretty widespread agreement among the people who study honeybee losses closely, including our own apiary inspector at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, that the biggest problem that these beekeepers face is really the problem of the mites and the associated viruses. Honeybees are different from all of the native bees. Honeybees have a really strange life cycle. So they evolved in Asia. The whole genus of Apis that they belong to evolved in Asia, but they've lived in Europe for, they estimate now, 300,000 years. And so European races have evolved, and that's what those races were what were brought to the US by the European settlers. They live in these really huge colonies with tens of thousands of workers. So a healthy honeybee colony can have like 40,000 workers in it. And they overwinter in a really strange way. Unlike practically all of the insects that we have here in Connecticut, they don't go dormant in the winter. They are still active inside the hive in the winter, and they keep the temperature up, and including in February, when the queen starts laying eggs, they will keep the temperature up close to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that's part of the reason why they need to store a lot of honey, is because essentially they burn honey with their metabolism in order to keep the temperature up. Because honeybees, if they get cold, if they get colder than about 50 degrees for very long, a honeybee will die. So they have to keep the temperature up through the whole winter within their colonies. And they reproduce as a colony by swarming. So a honeybee queen only lives independently of her colony during her actual mating flight. She flies out of the hive, goes to areas where the drones, the male honeybees, are congregating, mates with a number of different males, and then comes back to her hive, and then lives within the hive for the rest of her life, lives within the colony for the rest of her life. As the colony produces a new queen, the colony can reproduce by swarming. So the old queen will fly out with the workers. And that's actually how there get to be more honeybee colonies, is through this division of a colony with a queen, as sort of budding off an entire colony, not a queen by herself. And then, as a lot of people know, they have this unique system of communicating within the colony, where scout bees who find great sources of nectar or pollen can do the waggle dance to recruit foragers and communicate where there are sources of food. So honeybees are very, very different from all the other insects, including other bees that we have. So now we're going to switch gears and talk about a lot of the other kinds of bees that we have. So bumblebees, sweat bees. So on the left is a bumblebee on red clover. One of the green sweat bees on a coneflower, and another sweat bee, a common sweat bee, on the daisy on the right. And so a lot of people think that we are entirely dependent on honeybees for our crop pollination, and that is not, as I've mentioned before, necessarily true. So this is a study that was done in Virginia, looking at a number of different crops. So the light blue slice of the pie for each of these graphs that's how much of the visitation to the flowers was done by honeybees. The dark blue slice is bumblebees. And then this study, she didn't try to identify all the different other kinds of bees that she saw. There's carpenter bees here, this orange slice, but she just divided them into medium-sized and small bees. We'll talk more about what some of those categories would include. But you can see that honeybees were never really much more than a third of the pollination services for these different crops. And I have actually studied, as Jamie mentioned, pumpkins and winter squash. And so for those in the genus Cucurbita, which is a subset of cucurbids, I found that 2/3 of the visitation was done by bumblebees. Another sizable chunk, about 20%, was done by squash bees. And then just the remainder was done by honeybees. So, so we're dependent on a wide diversity of bees for crop pollination. Whoops. So bee diversity in Connecticut, as Jamie mentioned, I have this wonderful technician, Tracy Zarillo, who is really the person who identifies the bees. He credited me with that, but it's really Tracy who does it. She is working on a checklist of the species diversity of bees in Connecticut. And we will have certainly more than 349 species of bees when we're done. But this is what we had starting that project. 9 of the species are exotic from outside the United States. The rest of them are native to some part of the United States. I've already talked some about honeybees, which are exotic, not from here, and social. I'll talk more about bumblebees. We historically had 16 species of bumblebees. We've lost some of those species, and some of other species are declining. We have had 10 species of cellophane bees, 20 species of mason bees. People may have heard of mason bees. Those are the solitary bees that live in tunnels, and that people have bee hotels that can accommodate these mason bees. 84 species in the genus Andrena, and I'll talk more about that species in particular. And then over 91 species of sweat bees. So sweat bees are a very diverse group. Some of them are solitary, some of them are social. Some of them, you just saw an example, are bright green. Lots of them are like little black bees. So lots of bee diversity, much more than many people realize. As Jamie mentioned, we do long-term surveys. So we have been doing surveys at the White Memorial Conservation Center, at Stewart B. McKinney National Wildlife Refuge in Westbrook, and on a number of properties that belong to the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station. And we set out arrays of bee bowls. So 3 different colors. So you can see the blue here, and off in the distance, you can see a yellow bowl and a white bowl. So we do an array of 9 bowls, 3 different colors. And Jamie has been out there collecting these. So we collect them every 2 weeks. We check them every week. We collect them every 2 weeks. And we've been doing this over a long period of time with the idea of doing these surveys in a repeatable way that doesn't involve a huge amount of labor for our cooperators like Jamie, but that then we can compare results over time and get some information about how the bee diversity and abundance is changing over time. And in 1 year of bee surveys at White Memorial, we found 17 genera. So a scientific name is a genus and a species. So a genus is a more general category, and then there are species within genera. So we found 54 species and 17 genera in 1 year of our survey. And in that year, we found 12 species in the genus Andrena, including this specialist on bellwort, which is a pretty rare bee. So it's one that we were pretty excited to find, this Andrena uvulari, which is a specialist on bellwort. So this is a bee that can sort of hang upside down in the bellwort flowers and reach in there and get access to the nectar and pollen. And so to look a little more generally at the genus Andrena. So as I said earlier, we have 84 species of this genus in Connecticut. They're all ground nesting bees. So a common name for them is digger bees. And they are all solitary bees. For the most part, they have no venom. So as I said, solitary bees are very unlikely to sting, and these Andrena bees have pretty much lost the ability to sting. Many of them are plant specialists. So I'll talk a little more about specialization among solitary bees here in a second.
Kim?
Yes.
We had a question here from Victoria that's asking how those bee bowls work. She wants to know how they function.
Okay, so the bee bowls are essentially fooling the bees into thinking they're landing on a flower. So that's why they're colored, and we have different colors because different colors are attractive to different bees. And they land in the fluid in the bee bowls. So we have a mixture of propylene glycol and water with a little bit of soap so that it breaks the surface tension, and the bee lands in the bee bowl and can't escape. So the bee bowls do tend to catch the small bees, like the sweat bees in particular, whereas the larger bees are a little more able to escape from those bee bowls. So that's the basic idea. So bees, so this is from New York State. This is from Dr. Laura Russo in New York State, who was looking at apple trees and what kinds of bees were visiting apple trees. And you can see she broke down her categories a little differently from the other slide, but you can see that most of the bees on apple trees were mining bees, which is what she called the genus Andrena. So mining bees or digger bees or Andrena. And then a substantial chunk of them, in this case, probably a little more than a third, were honeybees. And then sweat bees, bumblebees, cellophane bees, and mason bees were also visiting the flowering apple trees. So, and she went on then to identify all these different species of bees, and she found something on the order of 60 different species of mining bees were visiting apple trees in New York State. So again, we're dependent for our crop pollination on a diversity of bees, including honeybees. So maybe I should stop a little bit and see if there are other questions.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. So Cynthia has several questions, but we have a lot of people asking about what they could possibly do in their own yards, and I think you're going to be getting to that point.
Oh yeah, that's that. I'll talk to that about
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Right. So, but it seems like there's a lot of general interest in what you're talking about. Really wanting to know how they can become more involved in protecting bees. So I think wherever you're going with your presentation, there's a lot of interest in what you're about to say.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right. So this is about the life cycle of solitary bees. So if we looked at the life cycle of one of those Andrena bees, those ground nesting bees, each female, because they're solitary, each female makes her own nest. So she would make a tunnel in the ground, and she would make cells like this cell here that come off the tunnel. Each cell she would stock with a ball of mixed pollen and nectar, and then she would lay an egg on that provision, and then she would close off the cell. So unlike honeybees or bumblebees for that matter, there's no maternal care for these solitary bees. People now just recently have been looking at what happens to this provision, and they've found that the larvae may be feeding not directly on the pollen and nectar, but on the fermentation products, on the yeasts and the bacteria that grow in this provision of pollen and nectar. The larva feeds on that provision and develops to whatever stage it goes to overwinter in. In this case, it would be a pupa. So it feeds until it reaches that stage, and then would spend the rest of the year, in this case of these ground nesting bees, would spend the rest of the year in the ground until the time comes to emerge as an adult. The following year, typically the males would emerge first, and then the females would emerge. They would mate. The males then, just feed on nectar, and the females are the ones that feed on nectar for their own energy, and then they also collect nectar and pollen in order to stock the nests. So the adults are only out for these solitary bees. We don't have any, as far as we know, that have more than one generation a year. So these solitary bees are out only for like 6 to 8 weeks. And then the rest of their life cycle is spent in the nest. So in the case of these ground nesting bees, it would be in the ground. In the case of, for example, mason bees that make their nests in tunnels or in tunnels in wood or hollow stems, that they would spend the rest of their lives in whatever the nesting material is. So many of the solitary bees are specialists that feed their larvae only a certain kind of pollen. So this example is a squash bee. So this is a female squash bee who is collecting pollen on a pumpkin flower. And so what it means for a bee to be a specialist, it means that only that kind of pollen is collected by the female to feed the larvae. So she might feed on other kinds of flowers for nectar, and the males might also feed on other flowers for nectar, but the specialization is in what kind of pollen they feed their larvae. And so, do native bees need native plants exclusively? So the social bees, bumblebees and some of the sweat bees that have colonies that run for a long season have to be more generalist. They have to be able to maintain their colonies, and they may prefer native plants, but they have to be able to adapt to a number of different species of plants in order to be able to have a long season and develop a colony over that season. The solitary bees, as I mentioned, have a short season of activity. So some of them may specialize on the pollen of a particular native genus, like the squash bee we saw just specializes on the genus Cucurbita. Some others are a little more generalized. They feed on a few genera, or they may be more generalized and feed on a wide variety of blooming plants during their limited season of activity. So, some bees are very specifically dependent on particular native plants. Others are more generalist. This is information that comes from a paper by Jared Fowler and Sam Droege, looking at genera of plants that have specialist bees. And a lot of these plants are just really wonderful plants for a wide diversity of different pollinators as well. For example, goldenrod has 11 species of specialist bees, but if you've ever gone out and looked at goldenrod has also a lot of generalist bees, including honeybees and bumblebees, has lots of different wasps, has beetles, lots of different kinds of insects feeding on their flowers. So these plants have specialists, but they're not dependent necessarily on the specialists for pollination, but the specialist bees are dependent on the supply of plants. So some of our native asters, like New England aster is in the genus Symphyotrichum. Those asters have specialist bees. And then there are a number of others, wildflowers like yellow loosestrife, which is different from purple loosestrife. Yellow loosestrife is not the invasive species. Sunflowers, some other kinds of goldenrod, and many others. But then also I want to emphasize, a lot of times people think of only the wildflowers as being important for bees, but there are also a lot of shrubs and trees that are important. So willows, again, willows have 8 species of specialist bees in New England, but they are also great for a wide diversity of other pollinators. The genus Vaccinium that includes blueberries, and some of these other species are also, we found just recently the specialist bee on hibiscus, which is Tilothrix bombiformis. So it's like a very interesting bee that is ground nesting, that specializes on feeding its larvae just the pollen of hibiscus. So a lot of really cool specialist bees. So now we're going to switch and talk about bumblebees. And this is also a picture I took in my yard of a bumblebee on the mountain mints, a great plant. So bumblebees are important pollinators. This is a female pumpkin flower, and you can see bumblebees visiting the pumpkin stigma, the stigma of the pumpkin flowers. And as I said, like 2/3 of the visitors on pumpkin flowers are bumblebees. And as I also mentioned, we historically had 16 species of bumblebees, some of which we have lost. So Bombus affinis, the first one on the list, some people may have heard of as the rusty-patched bumblebee. That is a federally listed endangered species. And it used to be pretty common in Connecticut. In particular, I've talked to a number of people at Conn College. They used to study Bombus affinis behavior and visitation on different plants at Conn College as part of the ecology course. So it was common enough that the students would do their projects looking at Bombus affinis. We haven't found one in Connecticut since 1997. And there are patches of this rusty patched bumblebee in the upper Midwest and in the Appalachians, but nowhere in New England, as far as we know, since around 2000, the early 2000s. Bombus ashtoni has also probably disappeared from this state. We did find Bombus terricola, which is a state-listed species. We went specifically up to the northwest corner, your part of Connecticut, Jamie, where we found some males of Bombus terricola. So that still does exist in the state of Connecticut. So you can see there are a number of species that are declining. And some species that have been increasing, Bombus impatiens in particular, has been increasing in the Northeast. There's been a lot of study about why bumblebees are declining, not just here in the Northeast, but across the country and around the world. There have been a number of losses of bumblebee diversity in Europe and China and Latin America. And there are a lot of different causes. So some of it has to do with more intensive agriculture. Some of it has to do with loss of habitat. Some of it probably has to do with the spread of pathogens, but some of it also very likely has to do with increased use of pesticides that are more toxic to bumblebees.
Kim?
Yes.
Mike had a question regarding pesticides that target mosquitoes. Is there any connection with, are they harmful? Are the mosquito pesticides harmful to bees?
So the pesticides that are sprayed against adults, which are generally in the category of pyrethroids, are in fact very toxic to bees. There's a lot of interest in more integrated pest management of mosquitoes. And actually in the handout that I sent you, there are links to the Ecological Management of Mosquitoes, a publication by the Xerxes Society, which emphasizes managing mosquitoes in the larval stage. There are a lot of things people can do in how they manage water, and also materials that can be applied to water where the mosquitoes are developing as larvae. That's where mosquito larvae develop, is in water, that can control the mosquito larvae without being broadly toxic to a wide range of different organisms. So that's the best way to manage mosquitoes, is to do it in the larval stage. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
So to look at the bumblebee life cycle, so let's start with the winter. So unlike honeybees, where as I talked about, the honeybees are overwintering as a colony, bumblebees, only the mated queens overwinter. So queens need to find a place to hibernate. And this is actually something we don't know enough about, where queens hibernate over the winter. So that's a good thing for people to do scientific research about. But they find places to hide. They come out in the spring. I often see them flying in the spring, zigzagging back and forth over the surface of the ground, looking for places to create their nests. The queen, when she comes out, she has to do her own foraging for pollen She needs to eat pollen in order for her ovaries to develop so she can start laying eggs. She also has to do her own foraging for nectar, which is her source of energy. And also the material that she then transforms into wax so she can make a wax coating for her nest. So she finds places to nest, and I'll talk more about where bumblebees nest in a minute. But then she starts laying eggs on her provisions of pollen and nectar. And the larvae hatch out, they start feeding on those provisions. She has to keep stocking the pollen and nectar. So she has to go out, continue going out foraging. And she then is incubating. So this is a honeybee queen who's applying her abdomen to the larvae, and she has a way of heating up her abdomen so that she can make the larvae develop faster. But in order to do that, she needs to consume a lot of nectar, and she can only store like a thimble full of honey. So she has to go out foraging for that nectar, store it as honey, and she can only store about a day's supply of honey when she's incubating her larvae. Then once the larvae develop all the way to hatch out as workers, then the workers take over and she becomes more like a honeybee queen. She then is laying eggs and the workers go out and do the foraging, maintain the nest. So the colony grows, the bumblebee colony can grow to be maybe 400 workers in a successful colony. And then there's a switch that happens and the colony starts to produce males and new queens. And that might happen at the end of the summer or early in the fall. Then the new queens need to go out and forage too. And they mate with the males. The males and the workers all die off. As I said, it's only the mated queens who overwinter. The queens only have, when they're overwintering, the amount of food that they can store in their fat bodies. So they need to stock up themselves and have adequate food for the period when they're dormant in the winter and when they emerge again in the spring. And so that's the life cycle. And as you can tell from that life cycle, there are some critical stages in the bumblebee life cycle. So this is from a study that was done in England to look at how much habitat is needed for wild pollinators in a sort of agricultural intensive area where they were doing deliberate planting for pollinators in England. And what they found is that there are some critical periods and critical needs. So what was most important is to have the combination of early season trees and shrubs that are blooming when the queens are establishing their nests and incubating their larvae, and then sources of nutritious pollen throughout the season so that the colonies then could develop to a stage where they would then start producing new queens and males. And then, so late in the season, as I mentioned, is also important. The nesting habitat they found was not as important for surviving from one year to the next, but was really important for the ability of the bumblebees to be able to disperse. And so they needed to be able to find nests in order to move into new areas. And then, as I said, we know very little about where bumblebees are nesting and where they're overwintering. But then protection from pesticides is also really important for bumblebees. This is from a colleague of mine, Ann Averill, in Massachusetts. And so she looked at bumblebee queens and looked at where they could be found and what pollen they had on them, and found this list of early season plants for bumblebee queens. And so again, I emphasize trees and shrubs are really important. A lot of people don't realize how important those flowering trees and shrubs, which only flower for a short time, and some of which we don't even think of as like showy flowering plants like the hollies. But they still provide a lot of nectar and pollen for a diversity of different insects. So willows, hollies, and a number of different kinds of trees and shrubs are important.
Kim, before you move on, there was one question from Gloria. She wants to know what happens to the bumblebee worker bees and how does the queen attract them? So the queen is the overwintering bee. How does she get workers, the worker bees?
Okay, so as I said, yeah, so the queen is the one who overwinters. So the workers in the fall, the workers remaining all die off. They don't go through the winter. And so the queen starts out by herself, as sort of a single mom. And then she has to produce the workers. She doesn't attract the workers, she produces the workers. So she makes the nest, stocks the nest with the pollen and nectar that the workers are going to need, lays the eggs on those stores of pollen and nectar, incubates the larvae until they reach the stage of emerging as workers, and then she has workers. So she has to produce those workers. That's how that happens. Yeah. So, as I've said a few times, pesticides, a lot of people don't realize that most insecticides are broad spectrum. So insecticides, as we were saying, insecticides that will kill mosquitoes in flight are toxic to a wide range of insects, and that includes bees. So it's important to use integrated pest management, which is the sort of fancy name that entomologists use for using alternative methods of control wherever it's possible, and then minimizing the use of pesticides. So if you need to use a pesticide, use the least amount needed and use it at the time and location where it will be the most effective. So as we were saying for mosquitoes, to control the mosquitoes when they're in the larval stage, instead of broadly spraying pesticides when they're in the air, when they're in the adult stage. So you don't want to apply insecticides that are toxic to bees to plants that are in bloom. So like people who have apple orchards, who depend on honeybees and other native bees for pollination, they don't spray insecticides when their apple trees are in bloom because that would kill the bees. And when they spray insecticides to control some of the apple pests later on, when the fruit is developing, they remove any kind of blooming plants that are in the aisles. For example, they might have dandelions or white clover growing in the aisles. And so they actually mow down those flowers before they apply insecticides. So, so it's important to think about that. So sometimes people are only thinking about the target plant that they're applying the insecticides to, and not like the other plants that are around that the bees might be visiting. Identify honeybee hives and avoid exposing the honeybee hives to pesticides. And then systemic insecticides, such as the neonicotinoids, and in particular, these neonicotinoids. It's a broad group, and some of them are more toxic than others, but these particular neonicotinoids are restricted use pesticides in Connecticut. So that means that homeowners can't get these insecticides. Only people who are licensed pesticide applicators can use these systemic insecticides. And that's because they are toxic to bees, and they have a lot of other non-target effects as well. But they are really widely used in this country, and for the most part, they are used as seed treatments. So for example, in the Midwest, where they grow really large acreages of corn and soybeans. So maize in this graph, that's the scientific name for corn. Um, uh, so a huge amount, and this only goes through 2015, but it's still true that a huge amount of the corn that's planted in the United States is treated with these neonicotinoid insecticides, and also a lot of the soybeans, and they're treated with the most toxic of these neonicotinoids. So all of these except acetamiprid, which you see is just like this little tiny thin line, all of these are very highly toxic to bees. So there are more acres in the US treated with neonicotinoids than for any other insecticide in history of the United States. And that's because they're so widely used as seed treatments on a huge amount of acreage in this country. And in some places, again, for example, in the Midwest, where they're rotating corn and soybeans, or corn and soybeans and wheat, oftentimes multiple crops in the rotation are treated with neonicotinoids. Several major studies have questioned whether there's an economic benefit. So it's become sort of a default when you buy corn seed, unless you're specifically buying organic seed where they know that they can't apply those neonicotinoids. It's sort of routine that it's all treated with these neonicotinoids. And people now have found, as we often find when insecticides have been used on a routine basis without using integrated pest management, that they have a negative effect on insect natural enemies. And so that makes some of the other pests bigger problems than they would otherwise be, and that we are getting resistance to these neonicotinoids in pests because they're exposed to the same group of chemicals year after year. And so this is a diagram that comes from a paper in the journal Science, where they were talking about how much of the seed treatment ends up not in the crop. So these are systemic insecticides, these neonicotinoids, and the value of them is that they can travel into the crop through the crop plant, and even when they're applied as seeds, but only 5% of them actually goes into the crop. Some of them goes off as dust at the time of planting, but they're water soluble. That's part of what makes them able to travel in the crop. And that means that they travel in the water. So these insecticides have been banned in Europe because of their effects on bees. And that's in large part because they were traveling into the plants in the margin of the fields and wood and hedgerow plants. But they're also being banned in Canada because they get into waterways and they kill the aquatic insects in the waterways. So they have wide-ranging non-target effects, particularly because of the scale on which they're being used in this country. And as you might expect, when these insecticides get into the soil, then they have the potential of affecting the soil nesting insects, including the soil nesting bees. So this is a study looking at squash bees. So this bee that we saw earlier, that's a soil nesting bee that is a specialist on pumpkins and squash. And so they're nesting often in the pumpkin and squash fields, and pumpkins can also have seed treatments of these insecticides, but they also nest a lot in cornfields. And so the pesticides that are in the soil would be affecting these ground nesting bees. So then to sort of back up and talk about pollinator habitat, maybe I should see if there's other questions before I go on here.
Yeah, so there's one question regarding how long these systemic treatments are, the neonicotinoids that they put on the seeds, how long they remain systemic in the ecosystem.
So that's a very interesting and difficult question to answer. So they last in the plant for a relatively limited amount of time. So people studying, well, actually in crop plants like corn plants, they last for a fairly limited amount of time. They last for a period of like a month or two. In trees, they can last for much longer. My colleague Rich Coles has done a lot of work looking at hemlocks, because these are used for controlling hemlock woolly adelgid, and has found that they will, the pesticides will last for multiple years and continue to control hemlock woolly adelgid for multiple years. That doesn't really affect bees, because bees don't visit hemlock trees, but raises concerns about other trees. And then they can last for a very variable amount of time in the soil. So there are studies depending on how much organic matter there is in the soil and what the soil type is, that have them lasting from months or to a year in the soil. So they can last for a long time in some environments, but it's very variable. So that's a difficult question. So I'll go on and talk more about pollinator habitat. So the ideal pollinator habitat would be to have native trees and shrubs and native herbaceous perennials with enough diversity to have at least 3 species flowering throughout the season, so that there's a diversity of different structures of flowers and types of pollen and nectar for bees to feed on. If you're interested in moths and butterflies as pollinators, you would need to have the larval host plants for the moth and butterfly caterpillars. And again, that's often involves trees as well. There's a scientist, Doug Tallamy, who talks a lot about the importance of native trees and oaks, for example, in providing host plants for moth and butterfly caterpillars. So limiting the use of insecticides and fungicides, and limiting herbicides to managing invasive or other kinds of undesirable species, and then providing nesting habitat. And I'll talk more about that in the next few slides. But oftentimes people are cleaning up their brush, their dead wood, and their leaves, and those can also provide habitat, like nesting habitat, overwintering habitat for a lot of different pollinators. But on a practical level, if you have diverse flowering plants with little or no pesticide use, and you have something other than a lawn or pavement, then that's better than having lawn and pavement. So looking at pollinator habitat on farms. So I've worked some with farmers on developing pollinator habitat. It's tricky because if they are farms like the orchards that I mentioned earlier, that are dependent on pollinators, but are also using insecticides or even fungicides, you need to be thinking about, the farmer needs to be thinking about protecting the pollinator habitat from the pesticides. Otherwise, you might create an ecological trap where you are attracting in the pollinators and then they're exposing them to pesticides. So some of these examples, this is an organic farm that does not use any pesticides on their squash. So they are growing pumpkins and squash, and they're growing buckwheat, which is not a native plant, but which has a lot of nectar and pollen and attracts a lot of honeybees and also a lot of syrphid flies as pollinators. So that's one way to do pollinator habitat. Down here, this is yellow sweet clover, which again is not a native plant, but is a tremendous source of nectar for honeybees. And so this is a livestock farmer who is also a beekeeper and grows the yellow sweet clover and uses that as forage for his livestock and also forage for his honeybees, and grows it in an area where it's protected from pesticides. And then this is a farm where they designated particular areas specifically for pollinator habitat, and where they're growing goldenrod and anise hyssop, which are both very attractive to a wide range of different pollinators, and growing them in an area where they're protected from pesticides. So these are the recommendations from the Xerces Society for pesticide-free buffers for pollinator habitat. So you want to be at least 40 feet from ground-based pesticide application and 60 feet from air blast sprayers. So oftentimes the air blast sprayers are what people are using for aerial spraying for mosquitoes. And then also a long distance from the crops treated with neonicotinoids. And you want to be upwind of where the pesticides are used if possible. So homes can be refuges for bees, and this is actually my home garden. So you will notice that my front yard has no lawn. There's actually a little bit of lawn between this sidewalk and the street, but I'm carving away bits and pieces of that. And so I minimize the amount of lawn that I have. Back here, this is all violets, actually. I got rid of my grass and it turned into violets. This is a flowering cherry. This is Packer aria, which we actually also saw a picture of earlier, which is a native ground cover. So I'm going with native ground covers and trees and shrubs. And I enjoy growing a lot of fruit. So I grow elderberries and black currants and blueberries, as well as cherries in my own yard. And then I have this native dogwood, lots of pollinator plants. This is actually a book that I wish I had seen before designing my yard. So native plants for the small yard, if you, like me, have a tiny yard. And it has really great designs using native plants for things like actually planting between the sidewalk and the street, or planting a corner of your yard. So it's a great, and the whole book is actually on this pollinator pathway website, which I will talk about more in a minute. And then leaving the leaves. So I was talking about this in a webinar last night, and people were saying, you actually leave the leaves in your yard? So because I don't have a lawn, I don't really need to worry about the leaves smothering the lawn. So back in the backyard where I have all those ground covers, I just leave all the leaves from the oaks and the maples that I have in my yard and that my neighbors have. I only rake the leaves off the driveway and the sidewalk, and also some of my garden beds, my vegetable garden beds, to try and keep down the slugs. And I pile all those leaves, put all those leaves in my backyard. I create brush piles in the back of my backyard along the fence, where I keep the perennials. When I bring down the stems of the perennials, I leave them there, and I have some branches, and so lots of nesting material for lots of different kinds of critters, including things like fireflies and beetles and moths, as well as bees. If people have invasive plants, this is a nice publication, which is actually online. I think we've gotten rid of given away all of the printed copies of it, but you can find it on the Experiment Station website about native plants that are alternatives for the invasive plants that people consider to be ornamental. So they restore the ornamental value, but use native plants to use it. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about an issue I've become concerned about in recent months, which is the management of the rights of way under high voltage transmission lines. So in the 1950s at Conn College, Bill Nearing and some other colleagues developed ways of managing the rights of way. Before that, they were just blasting the whole right of way with herbicides. And they discovered that they could use selected, targeted use of herbicides to just remove the tall trees, and that they could develop a shrub layer that would suppress new tree saplings. And they could have herbaceous plants in just like right underneath the towers. And this was fabulous habitat for pollinators, and also for a lot of birds and for rare plants. The Connecticut Botanical Society has developed all kinds of information about how important these rights of way are for rare plants in Connecticut. This is from a publication by a colleague of mine, Dave Wagner, who studies Lepidoptera and also studies bees, looking at, and also he had a colleague, Ken Metzler, who was studying the plants in these rights of way in New England, talking about how important they are, or perhaps I should say they were, in providing habitat for a diversity of plants, bees, Lepidoptera, other kinds of animals. And you can see in these pictures that there were in these pictures at the time gravel roads to give them access, the power companies access to these transmission towers. But even as they were publishing this paper, they found that that Eversource specifically was doing this. They were like eliminating all of that pollinator habitat, paving over the rights of way with an impermeable layer of gravel, oftentimes up to an acre underneath these transmission towers, as they were replacing the wooden transmission towers with steel transmission towers. And so I just had a conference about this in March, and and there's a whole lot of material that we developed, the Connecticut Botanical Society, some work that I did, a whole committee of people, including Bob Askins of Conn College, about how to advocate for the biological value of your local transmission right of way. So if you live near one of these transmission lines and it hasn't already been paved over with gravel, you need to look at this and make sure that you are protecting your right of way, because they are, as we speak, doing this, replacing these transmission towers and paving over these rights of way. So then I also wanted to promote the whole idea of the pollinator pathway. So this is a network of different local initiatives to plant pollinator plants, native plant habitat that provides nutrition free of pesticides for pollinators. And the idea is to connect together existing natural areas with initiatives from private properties and public properties like the towns to connect together these areas in order to make corridors for the pollinators. And this started in Fairfield County, but has been spreading rapidly across the state. So you can see there's lots and lots of towns that are signed up. And this is often a local town initiative where the people in the town, the garden clubs, the land trusts, the parks, other kinds of natural areas all get together, map out the pollinator areas that exist, and talk about how to create corridors to connect them together. And this is just really taken off across Connecticut and Eastern New York State. And I just saw in their newsletter, they're starting to expand into part of Pennsylvania as well. I've mentioned a number of times the Xerces Society. The Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation covers a lot of different kinds of invertebrates, including things like fireflies and freshwater mussels, but they've done a lot of work on pollinator conservation. So I recommend their publications. This is my own website on the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station portal. So all of these are in the information resources handout that I provided to Jamie. He's going to provide to other people. So this is sort of the overall view of what you can do to help our bees. Reduce or eliminate the use of insecticides and fungicides. Use the herbicides carefully, mostly for invasive plants. Plant a diversity of flowering trees, shrubs, and perennials through the growing season. Consider eliminating your lawn. Leave natural areas for nesting and overwintering habitat. If you're a beekeeper, then you need to manage your mites to prevent the spread of honeybee diseases and work with your community to preserve and create pollinator habitat. So this is my contact information and my website. And then I wanted to also mention, oh, I don't have that here. I didn't have that here. I wanted to mention World Bee Day. I guess it's not in this version, but tomorrow is World Bee Day. There will be a lot of events on Facebook and YouTube, and there's an initiative for people to post pictures of their favorite bees. So just wanted to mention that. So now I'll take any other questions that people might have.
Sure. There was one question that was raised by Bliss. She wants to know, is it important to leave some bare ground for bees? Maybe not all vegetation. Is it important to maybe have a few bare patches of ground, of soil?
There are a number of studies that say that bare ground is important. I wonder, as a scientist, the extent to which we think bare ground is important because that's where we can see the nests. But it is true, I think, that if you have like thick grass, it becomes difficult, or thick vegetation, it becomes difficult for bees to make their nests in the ground. But I think bare ground or ground that has patchy vegetation provides more space for them to make their nests.
Okay. And are there people in, say, Massachusetts or Vermont or other folks in the area that have similar research programs as yourself and could provide information on at different states, especially as you move throughout New England? Or do you have any other folks some collaborators that you've been working with?
Yeah. So there are a number of people throughout the Northeast working on bees. So in Vermont, in particular, Leif Richardson is probably a national leader in the study of bumblebees in particular. And in Vermont and in Maine, there are citizen science initiatives to do surveys of bees. And in Vermont, I think it's particularly bumblebees, but in Maine, it's a wider range of bees. And actually also in New York State, Brian Danforth, who is a bee specialist at Cornell University, is leading a survey of pollinators, so focusing on bumblebees, on particular groups of other native bees, and then also some other pollinators, including some of the Lepidoptera.
Great. Kathy asked a quick question about the fact that, in some towns, they have really strict zoning laws about how your yard needs to look, it has to be mowed and so forth. Are there ways that people can still promote pollinators in their yard, but at the same time balance it with the zoning laws that they might have in certain communities?
Okay, yeah. So so there's a paper that's called something like Messy Ecology and neat frames. So you want to have frames around so that it communicates to people that this is a garden. So actually, when I started on my front yard, the first thing I did after eliminating the lawn was to put wooden frames in my yard. And I was doing that partly because I was going to grow vegetables in those frames. But you know, having walls, having raised beds that have frames around them, having another thing that people do is mow around the edges. So mow close to, like, for example, the sidewalk, so that things are not leaning over into the sidewalk. You don't want to be infringing on the public space. It helps to have a lot of things blooming. So blooming tends to communicate to people flowers as opposed to weeds. But perennials, you know, only bloom for a short time and then they're green. It helps to have signs. It helps to have a sign that says, this is pollinator habitat, and the Xerxes Society sells those signs. The pollinator pathway people have signs that say, this is pollinator habitat. So, so it helps just to communicate to people, this is a garden that I am managing on purpose. This is not abandoned property, because that's really what those zoning laws are trying to do, is discourage people from just abandoning their property.
Yes, yeah, that's great. We've taken up plenty of your time, Dr. Stoner, but thank you very much. And thank you for ending your presentation with your contact information. I'm going to encourage everyone that has a few more questions that may be specific to their yard to contact Dr. Stoner. And she, as well as all the colleagues that she has at Connecticut Ag Experiment Station, are just extremely helpful. And they're there to be our resource as residents of the state of Connecticut. They are just an extraordinary group of people that do some great work. So
I should caution you, though, that currently, as Jamie knows, my email does not work and my phone does not work. So the state government had like a big crash of our email and phone systems. So so I'm not sure if they're working today. Hopefully they will get it fixed, and then you can contact me later.
yeah, let's hope so. I guess everyone's going back to work with who knows, but thank you so much for your time, Dr. Stoner. This was really very informative and very helpful.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you for everyone that was attending. This was a great opportunity for people to see a really unique and important topic, especially since we're all sort of stuck to be near home. You know, this was a great topic to get people interested in going outdoors and trying to help pollinators. So thanks again, everybody. If you could, please visit our website. Dr. Stoner's brochures are under our special event page at www.whitememorialcc.org. And while you're there, please consider taking the time to become a member of White Memorial. We really appreciate it. And we'll be continuing these programs throughout the rest of the summer into for the rest of the year. So thanks again, Dr. Stoner.
Okay, thank you, Jamie.
We'll be in touch. Thanks
okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.